Directed by Michele Soavi, we are talking The Church, although that is the English translation of this Italian movie co-written by Dario Argento and actually stars Asia Argento, albeit when she was quite young. This is a 1989 movie that was originally envisioned as the third part of the Demons film, but was changed because they wanted it to kind of stand on its own and be a little bit more sophisticated. But it does kind of fall, I guess, under the kind of the demonic attack umbrella, if you will. Now, the story starts in the 12th century, I believe it is, where we have a bunch of Teutonic knights slaughtering this kind of compound where there is these kind of villagers, and they believe that they're some type of Satanists or something along the lines of that. In reality, they might just have the plague, but it's the 12th century, what are you going to do? And they decide to build a church on top of it to contain the evil, and inside this church there is a kind of a seal, effectively, with this kind of crucifix and this seven-eyed demon face on it, that if broken, all hell will break loose. But don't worry, the church has a fail-safe. They've installed a self-destruct mechanism, so to speak, in this church. And now in modern times we have a group of people who either working in this church or visiting for whatever reason, and will they be affected by this kind of curse which seems to have found a way up to the surface? Well, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what works in this movie's favour. Now, I have to say, this movie has some sublime imagery in it. It really does. I mean, actually a lot of the kind of the visuals, the kind of the demonic visuals are actually taken from paintings and things like that and translated to screen, and I think it's done very well. So considering this again is a 1989 movie, I think the scale of this movie, all the different kind of demonic signs and sort of imagery that you'll see here is very impressive, and obviously at this time clearly all done practically, and I have to say, visually speaking, it's an absolute treat. When we never really spend too much time on these scenes where we have these things that are happening, but we do see a variety of different horrific images, and this movie is full of kind of weird and bizarre, certainly in the kind of the last act of this movie, when this full force of this evil is unleashed upon these people that are trapped in this house. The movie also starts out pretty strong as well, with this scene of these Teutonic knights effectively slaughtering all of these people, and it kind of begs the question, who is the real evil here? Were these kind of villagers, so to speak, genuinely kind of satanic worshippers or some type of heretics, or is it the church themselves that with these barbaric sort of practices? Are they the ones that the true evil and have actually created this evil themselves? You know, it begs the question, doesn't it? So I found this movie's it has asked some interesting questions in a weird way. The movie's a little kind of scattershot with its story, I won't lie, but nonetheless I did find the broad strokes of this sort of story quite compelling. And this it's wonderfully kind of shot in this kind of church. Apparently they had to kind of use different kind of locations because the proprietors of these churches weren't so keen on having their church in a horror movie, which is quite amusing. But nonetheless, I think the visuals, the location shooting, and the set design that they've used really gives it this fantastic kind of gothic feel to it. What adds to that is this great musical score, which is kind of quite heavy, quite synthy, but also uses a lot of church style music as well. And there's just some great little touches. For example, there's these kind of statues of these hooded kind of figures that are kind of dotted around this sort of church. And at first I thought, is it just someone praying? But it's these sort of statues. And it just looks absolutely great, I have to say, and real kind of fun. Now, one thing that I would say maybe considered a negative as well as a positive is this movie doesn't really have a clear protagonist. It's a little bit like The Blob, the kind of the remake of The Blob, where you think it's going to be one guy, but it ends up being Kevin Dillon. And it's sort of like this, where we're introduced to a couple of characters early on, and we assume they're going to be our main characters, but in fact we have a kind of late in the game protagonist who we haven't really seen much of until that point. So which I found an interesting kind of choice. I'm going to come on to the negatives of that, but it kind of gives you a little bit of a surprise. It kind of goes in a direction maybe that you weren't necessarily expecting. And I think the movie's broad strokes of the story, as I say, are pretty strong. And it obviously has a very European feel to it. I do feel that a lot of this movie is somewhat kind of left up to interpretation. I think the movie originally being envisioned as Demon 3 has somewhat kind of changed the perspective of what this story could have been if it had been an entirely separate idea right from its inception. I do feel it's trying to still have its cake and eat it to some degree, but some people might not care, but it kind of has to be said. And obviously going from that, what does not work in this film, like I said, I think it's trying to be its own thing, but also still have remnants of that original idea, which makes it a little muddled. And I have to say as well, the movie is somewhat left open for interpretation, either by design or just because it was made with not really a solid story in mind, and so you have to kind of put in the blanks. I do feel it's, if you don't think about the minutiae too much, you can kind of just enjoy it for some type of kind of gothic craziness. The broad strokes make sense to me, and I think you can kind of take it as, were these in the original sequence where we have these Teutonic Knights, were those kind of characters that they were sort of thing, were they genuinely sort of Satan worshippers? It doesn't appear so. We don't see any evidence of that. Or is it the church's fault that they're kind of, the way they've just kind of gone in there, slaughtered people in the name of the church, has that created the evil itself? And that's how I took this film. So it was the church themselves that have caused this problem, although it kind of, they're also the kind of the redemption to a weird way. So again, it's kind of a little bit messy in kind of the regards to the plot. Let's talk about the sort of the characters. Like I said, we're introduced to a couple of characters. We have this librarian, first day on the job. You know, he comes in late. He immediately starts hitting on like the only sort of female member of staff in the vicinity. He steals a piece of parchment. And this is even before he's kind of affected by any sort of demonic presence. So I didn't think he was a particularly altruistic character to start with, and maybe that was the idea. Again, we have to take some things on face value here, I feel, with this movie. I don't necessarily think that was the idea here, but you can kind of look at it and interpret it that this guy, they make him out to be a protagonist, but really he's a little bit of a sleaze, if we're being completely honest. But nonetheless, we spend a bit of time with these sort of characters, and they end up being largely peripheral, to be honest. So that was sort of an odd choice. And speaking of the sort of the characters, I mean, the acting in this one's a little bit over the top. Now, I did watch this, a dubbed version, admittedly, but even so, the sort of physical acting, you can kind of still tell that it's a little bit over the top sometimes, and you know, some of the dialogue, at least the translation of that I've watched, wasn't the best dialogue. It wasn't exactly sparkling, but you know, it was serviceable, I would say, if we're kind of being kind here. I will say there's some sort of goofier moments, and even if you are willing to sort of just go along with it to a certain degree, there are some things here that I really felt you have to kind of like be very willing to just switch off your brain to a certain degree. When we have our demonic kind of attack at the end, where effectively the church doors are locked and people are subjected to a variety of demonic attacks, either directly or mentally, or something, you know, that sort of thing. We see a couple of deaths on screen, but people really seem nonplussed. And at that point, there is at least some of them haven't been infected by this demonic plague, so to speak. And it was, so we have some sort of goofy moments, even some of the visuals, I would say, although they are, I would say for the most part, very well done, very effective and artistic. There are still a couple of kind of goofy moments as well, if we're being 100% honest there. And then the kind of the climax, I would say, because we haven't built up what ends up being our main protagonist, I feel is a little bit on the abrupt side. Who ends up being our main protagonist, we really didn't spend a lot of time with, and you know, unlike the aforementioned The Blob, you don't really have that connection because we've spent so little time with this character beforehand. and then the ending seems a little abrupt to me. Overall though, this is a visual treat. It's very kind of an interesting movie, and you know, you can appreciate the artistic merits of this film to some degree, even though I think this story is a little bit scattershot and, you know, a little bit hokey at times, you might even say. I'll give it a 6 out of 10 though. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.